NAFTA's been a catastrophe for our country. It's been a catastrophe for our workers and our jobs and our companies. They're leaving our country. Maybe we do a new NAFTA and we put an extra F in the term NAFTA. You know what the F is for, right? Free and fair trade. Not just free trade, free and fair trade.
Donald Trump and his supporters are not the only ones who think the North American Free Trade Agreement is a bad deal. Many workers in Mexico feel they haven't benefited. Particularly farmers who've struggled to compete with the quantity and quality of crops produced by American farms.
The negotiators must make an effort and help rural Mexico. We have really been cast aside.
There have been 2 rounds of talks on renegotiating NAFTA. Mexico's labor market has been a sticking point. Many Mexican workers earn a quarter of what their American counterparts do, driving U.S. companies to move south. The 1994 deal gave the U.S. access to cheaper labor,
and I'm pleased with the progress that we have made,
making American companies more globally competitive. It also gave Mexico's economy a boost in investment. But many workers on both sides of the border feel the benefits didn't trickle down. In the US, the drawbacks of NAFTA are plain to see. Abandoned warehouses and factories, vestiges of a golden age for the American middle class that Trump says he'll bring back. But in Mexico, there's a hidden dimension of NAFTA, worker exploitation.
This renegotiation is really worrying us now, because it could lead to something worse. And we think the people aren't represented because they haven't even been consulted. There hasn't been a real consultation with unions, with social organizations, or with the people in general.
Many workers complain they have no leverage in negotiating their own wages. Instead of allowing workers to form collectives to negotiate salaries and working conditions, many international companies have set up protectionist unions, which exist only on paper. They're known as ghost unions.
We're right now negotiating NAFTA. In my opinion, Mexico's been very difficult, as they should be. Why wouldn't they be? They had a sweetheart deal for so many years.
Trump's push for a new deal could help the common man indeed, but in Mexico more than in the US. His threats to scrap NAFTA have focused attention on low wages earned by Mexican workers, an issue that appears likely to be addressed under any new deal. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Duncan Wood. He's the director of the Wilson Center's Mexico Institute. And also from Washington, D.C., Jeff Ferry, an economist and research director at the Coalition for a Prosperous America. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Duncan Wood, let me begin with you. Sir, why do you still think NAFTA is a good idea?
Why do I think it's a good idea? Because so much prosperity, employment, and so much of the competitiveness of this region depends upon a healthy NAFTA. What we've seen over the past 20 years is an impressive integration of the manufacturing production systems of the 3 countries of North America, allowing each of those economies to take advantage of its natural and national endowments. And so what we've seen is a transformation, really, of the North American economy from a time in the late 1980s when it was hugely uncompetitive at the global level to a point now where it is commonly seen as being the most competitive region in the world. What I think we've seen over the past 20 years or so is, in fact, the modernization of economic life in this region. And we've also seen a transformation of economies such as Mexico's, where they've moved from primarily commodities-based to being manufacturing, exporting powerhouses. I mean, Mexico has become a country that now exports more manufactured goods than the rest of Latin America combined. And in turn, prosperity levels have increased. Now, not as much as we would like them to have done, not as much as politicians have promised, but isn't that always the way? But what we do see now is that Mexico has become an enormously important export market for the United States of America, importing almost $250 billion into its economy every year from the United States.
Okay, so you've laid it out there. Jeff Ferry, prosperity, employment, competitiveness. What's your problem with NAFTA and what's Donald Trump's problem with NAFTA?
Well, I think what Duncan Woods has described is a fictional interpretation of the effects of NAFTA over the last 23 years. And free trade economists, and I say this as someone who was educated in that school of thought too, are very fond of using abstract concepts like competitiveness to describe a success that simply doesn't exist. What NAFTA has actually done, contrary to what Duncan Woods just said, and actually in accord with what President Trump has said on numerous occasions, is NAFTA has wreaked enormous economic damage on both the United States and Mexico. Mexico has not become a prosperous country. In Mexico, wages have stagnated over the last 20 years, and drug crime has risen. Mexico this year has posted several records for numbers of murders per month. It's become a more violent, lawless country than it was before NAFTA.
I don't see how you can possibly make the leap from NAFTA to drug deaths. It's an extraordinary leap of logic. And if we're going to talk about fictions here, let's talk about some actual figures. I mean, let's talk about the numbers of jobs that have actually been created by NAFTA. Let's talk about the number of Mexican firms that are investing in the United States, the number of firms from around the world who invest in this region because of the integration of those markets. That's something where if we're going to talk about facts and we're going to get away from the so-called fictions, throw me the figures out on the floor. I'd love to hear them.
The figures are as follows. You're absolutely right that what NAFTA has done is it has enabled multinational corporations to move factories out of the United States, south of the border, and has therefore created many jobs in Mexico. But remember, wages in Mexico are between 1/8 and 1/4 of what they are in the United States. So every job that moves south creates downward pressure on United States wages. That's why we've seen American auto industry wages fall by more than 20% since the year 2000. Now, what we've seen in Mexico, instead of what President Clinton, another starry-eyed peddler of fiction, said, instead of creating a nation of 120 million consumers, what NAFTA did was empower Mexican capitalists to open factories with ghost unions, as the report mentioned earlier in the program, that have held Mexican wages down. We have not seen that elsewhere in Latin America. In countries like Brazil, what we see are efforts to move towards democracy and have true labor unions. Let me finish. So, and
very briefly,
let me just close because he mentioned. Let me just mention one other thing. He said that I was talking fiction about drug crimes. What NAFTA did was it threw more than 1 million Mexicans off their small farms as Mexico bought cheap American corn. Many of those small farmers either emigrated to America to work in agriculture as illegal immigrants, or stayed in Mexico as homeless people, got involved in drugs, got involved in crime, because frankly, there aren't many people hiring in Mexico, and the drug gangs hire and they pay well.
Okay,
so this unregulated approach
the driver
caused this.
Okay, let me bring in
the driver of drug violence is, of course, demand in the United States.
Fair enough.
I mean, there's no doubt about the fact that it's massive demand here in the United States that drives it.
Fair enough. I don't want to go down the drugs war rabbit hole. But let me ask you, Duncan, let me take something that Jeff said and expand upon it. I'm not an economist, but a lot of the stuff that I read tends to say things like, you know, free trade between nations is great, but when it comes to something like NAFTA, when one country has more high-skilled labor and a fairer job market, and the other one has more low-skilled labor and a more exploitative job market, what free trade then does is only widen and deepen inequality. That's from what I read. Is it happening with NAFTA, Duncan?
Right. I think that there's no doubt that we have a serious problem with inequality in both the United States and in Mexico, and to a lesser extent in Canada, but it is certainly there. And so the question we have to ask is, what is the cause of that? And I think what would be useful to do is to retake one of Jeff's points earlier on about manufacturing job losses. Is it the fact that manufacturing jobs have gone to Mexico, or is it the fact that manufacturing jobs have been lost because of automation? Well, academic studies, and I'll cite one by Ball State University, recognizes that about 13% of manufacturing job losses over the last 20 years have been down to international trade, not NAFTA, but international trade. And we can put the large portion of that blame at China's door. But 87% of the manufacturing job losses of the last 20 years are actually down to automation and improvements in efficiency. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a transformation of this North American economic space, not because of NAFTA in that sense, where you're seeing manufacturing jobs being lost in the United States, but because of automation. Okay. And let me just be a little bit of a Cassandra here. We're about to see many, many more millions of jobs being lost in manufacturing because of this process.
Okay, so Jeff, are you falsely diagnosing the problem?
No, I don't think I am. I mean, of course, automation contributes to job loss in the United States, and of course, automation will continue. But fundamentally, what Duncan is trying to do, like many free trade economists, is to divert our attention to something which lets the governments off the hook and says, oh, nothing can be done, the robots are coming, get ready to be unemployed all your life. The reality is there's automation reducing jobs, but free trade, unregulated free trade with countries like Mexico has reduced both wages and employment levels in crucial industries in America. It would simply be an illusion to say that Mexico has 19 auto assembly plants and they're all there to export into the United States of America, and that has not cost any United States jobs.
Jeff,
out of the everybody except a free trade economist knows that's nonsense.
Jeff, let me ask you, out of the three countries,
sure,
who, as NAFTA stands right now, without reform, without it being scrapped, as it stands right now, who gains the most out of the three countries, the US, Mexico, and Canada?
Mexico gains the most because it has gone from a zero trade deficit with the United States to a $64 billion trade surplus. It is exporting. One of the fundamental problems, though, remember, is that because Mexico is run essentially by a plutocratic class, the vast majority of those benefits go to the upper class elite.
But then isn't your problem with Mexico's government and Mexico's democracy rather than NAFTA?
This is the point. I think this is one of the things that we have to distinguish. It's the fact that the Mexican government has not been able to actually help the adjustment process in the same way that the United States government and the Canadian governments have failed as well. What you need here is actually active government programs to help the transition from commodities-based economy, agricultural-based economy in Mexico to a more manufacturing production-based economy. What you need to see in the United States is that government programs helping workers to transition as well. See, I mean, I think what we're neglecting here is the huge numbers of jobs that have been created and depend upon trade with Mexico here in the United States. Ask the representatives and the senators from the state of Iowa about how important it is to their economy. Ask the representatives and the senators from the state of Wisconsin how important Mexico is. Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, all of these are states which depend upon this economic relationship so that they can have the 5 million jobs here in the United States that depend upon that bilateral relationship.
Jeff, the closer it gets to the U.S. midterms, we're hearing that the negotiations will continue and continue and continue, and the closer it gets to midterms, maybe Trump, for political reasons, maybe economic reasons as well, will scrap NAFTA. Is that what you want?
I think that if we cannot reform NAFTA in a way to benefit economic growth, and by economic growth I'm thinking particularly of the median family income of the average American family, then yes, scrapping NAFTA would be better than retaining this system, because all the figures you hear about jobs that depend on Mexico, those are all true, but what they omit to say is that all these jobs and all this interrelationship is a mechanism for creating American unemployment and driving down American wages, because wage convergence is implicit in the free trade system. And we were once the highest wage country in the world. We're no longer, but we're still a lot higher wage than Mexico. And we have to deal with this, and our politicians need to deal with this.
Duncan, tell me why you're shaking your head.
Well, I'm shaking my head because I think Jeff puts an enormous amount of faith in international trade deals that they can fix the underlying problems of the 21st century economy. That's not what they're there for. what free trade deals do is that they try to create a level playing field in terms of tariffs and non-tariff barriers between countries so that they can exchange goods and services. And what we've seen is exactly that in North America. It's not going to fix wage levels. It's not going to fix underlying economic development issues. Those are jobs for government and for civil society working together. And nobody denies that there's a lot of work to do on those things. But do not think that you're going to, by renegotiating NAFTA, you're going to fix any of those problems.
Jeff, let me give you the final word
I certainly
here.
agree. Thank you. I certainly agree that a lot more is needed than just undoing these negative and very difficult trade deals, but we need to undo them, and we need to get our politicians to focus on restoring American economic growth and income levels. And trade deals are a way of driving our income levels down. It's true they make prices lower, and it's true they help out the capitalists on both sides of the border, and I'm in favor of capitalism.
Let's not sell
I'm just
American
not in
goods
favor
in the
of
world.
excessive
Let's
capitalism.
do that.
Is that what you mean, Jeff?
No, we have a $500 billion trade deficit. All the most successful countries in the world have a trade surplus. This country needs to have a trade
That's
surplus.
simply
We need to be
not
exporting steel and automobiles and other things.
Okay, Duncan Wood and Jeff Ferry. I'll just quote to you what the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer said on those talks. He said, yeah, well, we're moving at warp speed, but we don't know whether we're going to get to a conclusion. That's the problem. We're running very quickly somewhere. Where that somewhere is, who knows? It's been a pleasure talking to both of you and picking your brains. Hope to have you on the program again in the not-too-distant future. Duncan Wood and Jeff Ferry, thank you for joining us on the Newsmakers.